Let me ask you something. What if their silence was never proof that you meant nothing? What if the distance, the disappearing, the unanswered messages, the months of quiet, what if none of it was actually about your worth? Because sometimes the person who walks away isn't walking away because they don't feel anything. Sometimes they're walking away because they feel too much and don't know what to do with it. And this is where you have to understand something powerful. You cannot control when another person becomes emotionally aware. You cannot force someone to confront what they feel. You cannot chase somebody into emotional maturity. But you can control what you do with the silence, and that is where your power begins. Tony Robbins has spent decades teaching people that transformation begins when you change the meaning you attach to an experience. So stop saying, they disappeared because I wasn't enough. Maybe they disappeared because they weren't ready. Stop saying they don't care. Maybe they don't know how to process what they feel. Stop saying, I've been forgotten. Maybe the chapter is still teaching you something you haven't understood yet, because sometimes the greatest transformation begins when you stop asking, why did they leave? And start asking, who am I becoming because they left? That question changes everything. Avoidant people can become incredibly convincing. They can convince themselves that they're fine. They can go weeks without reaching out. Months can pass. They may appear completely unaffected. They may continue living their life, posting pictures, working, laughing, meeting people, and giving the appearance that the relationship never mattered. But appearance is not always reality. Some people don't process emotions by moving toward them. They process emotions by moving away from them. They create distance. They stay busy. They rationalize. They suppress. They tell themselves, it wasn't that serious. And eventually they start believing the story they created. But buried emotions don't disappear simply because you refuse to look at them. They wait, and sometimes all it takes is one moment, one song, one familiar place. One photograph, one conversation, one unexpected memory, one night when everything becomes quiet, and suddenly the emotional wall they built begins to crack. But here's what I want you to understand. That moment is not your responsibility. You don't need to manufacture it. You don't need to send the perfect message. You don't need to post something designed to make them jealous. You don't need to prove how much you've changed. Your job is not to manipulate their emotions. Your job is to master yours, because the person who controls their emotional state has something more valuable than someone else's attention. They have freedom. Think about what happens when you chase something. You focus on it, you analyze it, you wait for it, you check your phone, you replay conversations, you wonder what they're thinking, you imagine what you should say. And slowly, without realizing it, you give another person control over your emotional state. That's not love, that's emotional dependency. And there is a difference. Love can be powerful. But when your identity depends on someone's response to you, you have handed them the steering wheel of your life. So what happens when you stop chasing? You return the steering wheel to yourself. You wake up and say, my life continues whether they come back or not. You start investing in your health, your purpose, your family, your business, your faith, your growth, your future. And suddenly something changes, not necessarily in them, in you. And that is the miracle. Because when you stop begging for someone to recognize your value, you begin recognizing it yourself. You don't become cold, you become centered. You don't stop caring. You stop abandoning yourself to be chosen by someone else. And that's a completely different level of strength. Human beings don't always appreciate constant access. When someone knows you're always available, they can unconsciously take your presence for granted. But when your presence disappears, reality becomes louder. They may suddenly notice the conversations they used to have, the comfort, the support, the laughter, the little things. The person who always answered, the person who always cared, the person who believed in them. And sometimes they don't recognize the value of something until the noise disappears. But listen carefully. You should never disappear as a strategy. Disappear because you're healing. Disappear because you're growing. Disappear because you're building. disappear because you finally understand that your life deserves your attention. There is a profound difference between withdrawing to manipulate someone and stepping back to reclaim yourself. One is a game, the other is growth, and growth has power. Because eventually you may reach a point where you don't even need them to notice your absence. You notice your own presence. You realize, I am here. I survived. I grew. I became stronger. And suddenly, their silence doesn't frighten you anymore. Imagine the version of you who stopped waiting, the version who stopped checking, the version who stopped explaining, the version who stopped asking, what did I do wrong? Imagine waking up one morning and realizing, I don't need to convince anybody that I'm worthy. That's transformation. And transformation is attractive, not because you're trying to attract someone, but because you're finally living from your own identity. You become disciplined, you become peaceful, you become intentional, you become selective about who receives access to your energy. You stop accepting crumbs because you remember what abundance feels like. And here's where life gets interesting. Sometimes the person who left you behind eventually encounters the new version of you. But you're different now. You don't need their approval. You don't need their apology. You don't need them to validate your healing. You can look at them with peace instead of desperation. And that's when you realize something extraordinary. The person you were waiting for was never the real destination. The real destination was becoming the person you were capable of becoming. There are seasons in life you will not understand while you're living them. You will ask, why did this happen? Why did they leave? Why didn't it work? Why did I have to experience this? But sometimes you don't receive the answer immediately. Sometimes the answer comes later. You look back and realize that what felt like rejection was redirection. What felt like abandonment created independence. What felt like heartbreak created wisdom. What felt like an ending created a new beginning. You may believe you need a particular person, but perhaps what you actually need is the lesson that experience was designed to teach you. Perhaps you're being pushed toward a stronger identity, a clearer purpose, a deeper faith, a healthier relationship with yourself. Never confuse delayed understanding with divine absence. Sometimes life is rearranging things you cannot yet see. And if you're walking through a season of silence right now, don't waste it. Use it. Pray, reflect, build, learn, heal, become, because the question isn't, when will they come back? The better question is, who will I be when they do or when they don't? That question puts your future back into your hands. Now we reach the deepest truth. Maybe one day they reach out, maybe they don't. Maybe they finally understand what they lost. Maybe they never do. Your life cannot be dependent on that answer because your worth existed before they met you. Your worth existed during the relationship, and your worth remains after the relationship. You don't become valuable because someone misses you. You don't become important because someone regrets losing you. You don't become worthy because someone finally sends as a message. You were already worthy. The relationship didn't create your value. Their silence didn't destroy it, and their return cannot increase it. That's freedom. And when you reach that level of emotional freedom, something beautiful happens. You stop trying to control outcomes. You start controlling your choices. You stop asking who will choose you. You start asking what you will choose. You choose peace. You choose purpose. You choose self-respect. You choose growth. You choose faith. You choose a future that is bigger than one person's decision. And if they return, you evaluate whether their actions match their words. You don't abandon your standards just because you missed them. You don't reopen the door simply because they knocked. You ask, has the relationship changed or has only the loneliness changed? That's wisdom. That's maturity. That's emotional strength. So remember this. They may go silent for months. They may convince themselves they've moved on. They may bury the memories. They may avoid the feelings. They may tell themselves they're better without you. And then one ordinary moment may bring everything back. But don't live your life waiting for that moment. Co-create your own moment. The moment you stop chasing, the moment you stop begging, the moment you stop questioning your worth, The moment you stop making somebody else's silence the soundtrack of your life, that moment can change everything, because the greatest comeback isn't when they finally call. The greatest comeback is when you finally come back to yourself, come back to your confidence, come back to your purpose, come back to your faith, come back to your discipline. Come back to the person you were before you started measuring your worth through somebody else's behavior. And if God has someone meant to walk beside you, let them meet you as the person you are becoming, not the broken version of yourself who is desperately waiting to be chosen. Don't chase, don't manipulate, don't beg, don't become bitter, come better. Because sometimes the door closing behind you is the very thing that forces you to see the door that was opening in front of you. And one day, you may look back and realize, I thought losing them was the end of my story. It was actually the beginning of mine. That's the moment everything changes. Not when they return, when you return to yourself. Let me tell you something that can completely change the way you look at silence. When someone disappears from your life, especially someone who once seemed deeply connected to you, your mind immediately begins creating explanations. You start thinking, maybe they never cared. Maybe I imagined the connection. Maybe I wasn't important enough. Maybe they found someone better. Maybe they moved on without feeling anything. But what if you are interpreting their silence through the wrong lens? Silence is not always the absence of emotion. Sometimes silence is the way a person escapes emotion. Some people don't know how to sit with uncomfortable feelings. They don't know how to process vulnerability, uncertainty, intimacy, or the fear of being deeply known. So instead of moving toward those emotions, they move away from them. They create distance. They become unavailable. They become busy. They convince themselves that they don't care. And from the outside, it can look incredibly convincing. They may go weeks without contacting you. Then weeks become months. You might see them living normally, laughing, working, traveling, posting pictures, or appearing completely unaffected. And you think, how can someone who once cared about me act like I never existed? But here's the truth. What people display externally does not always reveal what they experience internally. A person can miss you and still remain silent. A person can think about you and still refuse to reach out. A person can feel regret and still protect themselves from vulnerability. A person can love someone and still lack the emotional capacity to build a healthy relationship with them. That's why you must stop confusing someone's inability to express emotion with proof that you were meaningless. But there's another lesson here that is even more important. Their emotional process is not your responsibility. You cannot heal someone by chasing them. You cannot force someone to communicate by sending more messages. You cannot convince someone to confront their emotions by explaining your feelings one more time. And you certainly cannot build your peace around the possibility that one day they will finally understand. Your responsibility is yourself. Your responsibility is to take the pain and transform it into wisdom. Take the rejection and transform it into self-respect. Take the silence and transform it into growth. Take the uncertainty and transform it into faith. Because sometimes the greatest thing silence gives you is space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to discover who you are without their constant presence. Space to realize how much energy you were spending trying to understand someone else's behavior. And eventually, something begins to change inside you. You stop asking, why aren't they contacting me? You start asking, why am I allowing their silence to control my happiness? That question is powerful. Because the moment you take responsibility for your emotional state, you begin taking your power back. Maybe they return someday, maybe they don't. Maybe one unexpected moment brings every suppressed emotion back to the surface for them, but your life cannot be placed on pause waiting for that moment. Your healing cannot depend on their realization. Your future cannot depend on their decision. You have a purpose that is bigger than one person's silence. And perhaps this season is not about waiting for them to come back. Perhaps it is about coming back to yourself. Back to your confidence, back to your purpose, back to your faith, back to your standards, back to the version of you who knows that being ignored does not make you invisible, being rejected does not make you unworthy, and being left does not mean you were never valuable. Sometimes silence isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it is the space in which the next version of you is being built. There comes a moment when you have to stop chasing what keeps running from you. Not because you stopped caring, not because your heart suddenly became cold, and not because the person no longer matters. You stop chasing because you finally understand that love should never require you to abandon yourself. Think about what happens when you constantly pursue someone who has chosen distance. You send the message. You wait for the response. You check your phone. You analyze their last conversation. You wonder what they are thinking. You ask yourself what you could say differently. And every unanswered question creates another emotional attachment. Slowly, their behavior begins controlling your entire emotional world. If they respond, you're happy. If they don't, you're anxious. If they show interest, you feel hopeful. If they disappear, you feel rejected. And without realizing it, you have given another person the power to determine how you feel about yourself. That is not where your power belongs. Your power belongs with you. The moment you stop chasing, you create something incredibly important. Space. Space for them to make their own choices, but more importantly, space for you to make yours. You begin asking different questions. Instead of asking, how can I get them to come back? You ask, what kind of life do I want to create? Instead of asking, what message will make them miss me? You ask, what can I do today that makes me proud of myself? Instead of asking, why aren't they choosing me? You ask, why am I still waiting for someone who isn't choosing me right now? Those questions change your emotional position. You stop operating from desperation and start operating from self-respect. And understand this clearly, stopping the chase is not a manipulation tactic. It is not about disappearing so someone becomes jealous. It is not about posting pictures to make them wonder what you're doing. It is not about pretending you don't care. That's still chasing, just in disguise. Real detachment is different. Real detachment means you can care about someone without allowing their behavior to control your identity. You can miss them without contacting them. You can love them without begging them. You can remember the good times without forgetting the reasons you needed distance. You can hope for reconciliation while still building a beautiful life without it. That is emotional strength. And sometimes when you stop chasing, the entire dynamic changes because the other person finally experiences something they had been avoiding. Your absence, when you were always available, they never had to confront what your presence meant. But when you step back, they have to live with the reality of your absence. Maybe they notice the conversations that disappeared. Maybe they remember the way you supported them. Maybe they recognize the peace you brought into their life. Maybe one day they realize that the person they assumed would always be there is no longer standing at the same door waiting. But here's the most important part. Don't step away because you want them to notice. Step away because you noticed yourself. You noticed your exhaustion. You noticed how much you were giving. You noticed how often you were compromising your peace. You noticed that you were trying to earn something that should have been offered freely, and then you made a decision. I will no longer abandon myself just to keep someone else comfortable. That decision can become the beginning of an entirely different life. You start investing your energy into your body, your goals, your relationships, your work, your faith, and your future. You begin becoming the person you were supposed to become all along. And eventually, you realize that the greatest reward was never getting them to chase you. The greatest reward was no longer needing to be chased. Because when you become secure within yourself, someone else's silence cannot destroy your peace. Someone else's distance cannot define your worth. And someone's return cannot determine your happiness. You have already returned to yourself. And that is where real power begins. There is something powerful about absence that most people don't understand until they experience it themselves. When someone has constant access to you, they can become accustomed to your presence. Your messages become normal. Your attention becomes expected. Your support becomes something they assume will always be available. And sometimes people don't recognize the weight of your presence until they experience the silence of your absence. When an avoidant person creates distance, they may initially feel relief. They may believe they have escaped emotional pressure. They may tell themselves, this is better. I need space. I don't need this relationship anymore. They may even convince themselves that walking away was the strongest decision they could make. But time has a way of revealing what emotional avoidance tries to hide, because when the noise disappears, memories become louder. The conversations you once had may suddenly come back to them. A particular song may remind them of you. A familiar place may bring back an old moment. Something as simple as a phrase, a smell, a photograph, or a random situation can awaken an emotional memory they thought they had buried. And suddenly, the person who seems so distant begins remembering. They remember how you listened. They remember how you cared. They remember the moments when they felt understood. They remember the comfort of having someone who genuinely wanted the best for them. But don't misunderstand this. You should never make yourself disappear as a strategy to make someone miss you. That is still giving them control. If you stop contacting them only because you want them to panic, you're still emotionally connected to their reaction. True growth happens when your absence is not an act. It is a natural consequence of choosing yourself. You are no longer waiting by the phone. You are no longer checking whether they viewed your story. You are no longer trying to decode every silence. You are living. And there is a profound difference between trying to make someone miss you and simply becoming unavailable for what no longer serves your peace. When you begin living your life again, something changes inside you. You start waking up with goals that have nothing to do with them. You start laughing again without wondering whether they would approve. You start building relationships that make you feel valued. You start focusing on your career, your health, your family, your dreams, and your spiritual growth. And slowly, you stop measuring your progress by whether they have contacted you. That is when absence becomes powerful, not because it creates a reaction in them, but because it creates a transformation in you. Maybe one day they notice, maybe they wonder where you went. Maybe they ask themselves why you stopped reaching out. Maybe they begin to understand that your presence was not guaranteed, but their realization is no longer the center of your story. Your growth is, because imagine reaching a point where they finally return and you are no longer desperate for the message. You can read it calmly. You can listen without losing yourself. You can ask whether their actions have changed. You can decide whether their presence belongs in your future. That is a completely different position from where you started. You are no longer saying, please choose me. You are saying, show me that your actions deserve access to my life. That is self-respect. And sometimes the greatest lesson of absence is this. You don't need someone to miss you before you recognize your own value. You don't need someone to regret losing you before you understand what you brought to their life. You don't need their realization to validate your experience. Your presence had value whether they recognized it or not. Your love had meaning whether they appreciated it or not. Your heart was genuine whether they were ready for it or not. So don't spend your days wondering when they will finally feel your absence. Build a life so meaningful that you become fully present in your own existence. Let them have their journey. Let them process what they need to process. Let time reveal whatever it is meant to reveal, and you keep moving forward, because the real victory is not hearing them say, I miss you. The real victory is waking up one morning and realizing, I no longer need them to miss me. I finally stopped missing the person I was before I found myself again. There comes a moment in your life when you realize that the greatest response to being underestimated is not an argument. It is transformation. You don't need to convince someone that you are valuable. You don't need to explain how much you have changed. You don't need to announce your growth to anyone who walked away from you. You simply become different. And when you become different, everything around you begins to look different. Maybe the person who left you remembers the version of you who was always available. The version who answered immediately, who kept explaining, who tolerated uncertainty, who waited patiently, who tried to fix everything, and who constantly wondered what they could do to make the relationship work. But what happens when that person disappears? Not because they became bitter, but because they evolved. What happens when you stop begging for clarity and start creating clarity within yourself? What happens when you stop seeking validation and start building confidence? What happens when you stop asking someone else to recognize your worth and finally recognize it yourself? That is transformation. And transformation is powerful because it doesn't require permission. You can transform your life without anyone agreeing with you. You can become disciplined without anyone applauding. You can heal without receiving an apology. You can grow without receiving closure. You can become stronger without the person who hurt you ever knowing how much strength you developed. This is where your focus must shift. Don't build a better version of yourself so that someone regrets losing you. Build yourself because your future deserves the strongest version of you. Build your mind, build your body, build your character, build your purpose, build your relationship with God, build your financial stability, build your emotional intelligence, build your peace. Every day you make a small decision about who you are becoming, and those small decisions eventually create an identity. One day you look back and realize you are no longer the person who needed someone else's attention to feel important. You don't wake up checking your phone. You don't spend hours analyzing their silence. You don't need to know whether they're watching you from a distance. You don't need to prove that you're happy. You actually become happy. And that difference is enormous because pretending to move on is exhausting. Actually, moving forward is liberating. If they ever see you again, they may notice something different. Your energy is different. Your confidence is different. Your boundaries are different. Your expectations are different. You are no longer trying to convince them to stay. You are evaluating whether they belong in the life you have built. And perhaps that is the moment they never expected. They may have expected you to remain emotionally available forever. They may have expected you to keep reaching out. They may have expected you to wait, but instead, they encounter someone who has learned to stand firmly on their own. That can create a powerful realization, not because you manipulated them, not because you tried to make them jealous, but because your life continued. You became stronger, you became more peaceful, you became more intentional. And suddenly they see that the person they left behind was not the final version of you. But remember this. Their reaction is not the reward. Your transformation is the reward. If they return, you don't abandon your standards. If they apologize, you don't automatically forget the past. If they say they miss you, you don't immediately surrender your peace. You listen, you observe, you evaluate, because real transformation teaches you that words are easy, but consistent actions reveal character. You no longer fall in love with potential. You look for responsibility. You look for consistency. You look for emotional maturity. You look for respect. And if they cannot provide those things, you have the strength to continue walking. That is when you know you have truly changed. The goal was never to become so powerful that someone regrets leaving you. The goal was to become so whole that whether they regret it or not no longer determines your future. You don't need revenge. You don't need recognition. You don't need them to say, I made a mistake. Your life becomes the evidence. Your peace becomes the evidence. Your growth becomes the evidence. Your new identity becomes the evidence. And perhaps one of the greatest miracles is realizing that the person you were desperately trying to get back may not even be the person you want anymore, because you have grown beyond the version of yourself that accepted less than you deserved. You have become someone who understands that love should add to your life, not consume it. And from that place, you no longer chase the past. You build the future. You don't wait for someone else to change everything. You change yourself, and suddenly, everything changes. There are seasons in life that make no sense while you're living through them. You pray for an answer. You ask why something happened, and you wonder why the door you wanted to walk through suddenly closed. You may look at the silence of someone you loved and think, why did God allow this to happen? Why did I have to lose this person? Why couldn't things have worked out differently? But sometimes what feels like an ending is actually an invitation to grow, an invitation to become stronger, an invitation to discover a purpose you could not see while you were emotionally attached to the outcome. We often measure life according to our timing. We want answers now. We want closure now. We want the message now. We want the apology now. We want the relationship restored now. But divine timing doesn't always operate according to emotional timing. There are things you may desperately want today that would not be healthy for you tomorrow. There are doors you may cry over when they close, only to discover later that walking through them would have taken you somewhere you were never meant to stay. And sometimes, a person can leave your life, and you interpret it as punishment when it may actually be preparation. Maybe the distance is giving you room to discover yourself. Maybe the silence is forcing you to stop depending on another person's attention. Maybe the heartbreak is revealing wounds you never knew existed. Maybe the unanswered questions are teaching you to trust without having every detail explained. Faith does not mean you understand everything. Faith means you continue moving forward even when you don't. That is one of the hardest lessons in life, because when someone becomes distant, your mind wants certainty. You want to know what they are thinking. You want to know whether they miss you. You want to know whether they will return. You want to know whether the story is over, but sometimes the healthiest answer is to release the demand for certainty. You can say, I don't know what they are going to do, but I know what I am going to do. And what are you going to do? You're going to live. You're going to heal. You're going to grow. You're going to become disciplined. You're going to strengthen your faith. You're going to pursue your purpose. You're going to become the person you were created to become, because your destiny cannot be placed on hold while you wait for another human being to make a decision. Think about how much energy is wasted waiting for someone to change. Imagine taking that same energy and investing it into your future. Imagine what happens when the hours spent checking your phone become hours spent learning. The energy spent replaying conversations becomes energy spent building your career. The tears you spent asking why become prayers asking for wisdom. The loneliness becomes solitude. And solitude becomes self-discovery. That is how pain can become purpose. Maybe someday that person returns. Maybe they don't. Maybe they finally understand your value. Maybe they never do. But divine purpose is bigger than their recognition. You were not created merely to be chosen by one person. You were created to live, to grow, to serve, to love, to learn, and to fulfill the purpose placed within you. So stop interpreting every closed door as rejection. Sometimes a closed door is protection. Sometimes a delay is preparation. Sometimes distance is redirection. Sometimes silence creates the space necessary for you to hear what you couldn't hear when everything was emotionally loud. And perhaps this is your season to stop demanding an immediate explanation and start trusting the process. You don't have to know exactly where the road leads. You only need enough faith to take the next step. One step toward healing, one step toward discipline, one step toward peace, one step toward purpose, one step toward God. And eventually you may look back and understand why you had to walk through that season. You may realize that what you called heartbreak was actually the beginning of your awakening. What you called rejection was the beginning of your self-respect. What you called abandonment was the moment you learned how to stand on your own, and what you called an ending was simply the beginning of a chapter you couldn't see yet. So trust the timing. Don't force what isn't ready. Don't chase what is running. Don't beg for what should be freely given. Keep becoming, keep believing, keep moving, because sometimes life removes something from your hands not to leave you empty, but to make room for something greater. And when you finally understand that, you stop asking, why did they leave? You begin asking the more powerful question, what is this season preparing me to become? That question can change your entire life. Now we come to the deepest part of this journey, because eventually you have to understand that the greatest victory is not getting someone to come back. The greatest victory is becoming someone who no longer needs their return to feel complete. Think about that for a moment. What if they never message you again? What if they never explain themselves? What if they never admit that they hurt you? What if they never say, I made a mistake? Can you still build a beautiful life? Can you still wake up with purpose? Can you still believe in love? Can you still trust yourself? The answer has to be yes, because if your happiness depends on another person's decision, then you have given them authority over a life they were never supposed to control. Your worth existed before they met you. Your worth existed while they loved you. Your worth existed when they walked away. And your worth will exist whether they return or never come back. This is the mindset that changes everything. You stop waiting for someone else's validation and start validating your own experience. You stop asking, was I enough for them? And start asking, was this relationship enough for the person I am becoming? That's a completely different question, because growth changes your standards. When you are hurting, you may only want the person back. But when you heal, you begin asking whether the relationship actually deserves another opportunity. If they return, don't be impressed by words alone. Listen to what they say, but watch what they consistently do. Have they taken responsibility? Have they developed emotional maturity? Have they learned how to communicate? Are they willing to create something healthier? Are their actions aligned with their promises? Because missing someone is not the same thing as being ready for them. Regretting a loss is not the same thing as having the capacity to build a healthy relationship. And someone reaching out does not automatically mean they have changed. That's why your healing matters. Healing gives you the ability to respond instead of react. The old version of you might have seen one message and immediately forgotten every painful moment. The healed version pauses. The healed version breathes. The healed version asks questions. The healed version protects peace. That doesn't mean you become heartless. It means you become wise. You can love someone and still have boundaries. You can forgive someone and still require accountability. You can miss someone and still choose not to return. You can wish someone well without giving them unlimited access to your life. That is emotional freedom. And perhaps the most beautiful thing happens when you reach this point. Their return is no longer the prize. Your peace is the prize. Your growth is the prize. Your relationship with yourself is the prize. Your purpose is the prize. Your ability to sleep peacefully at night without wondering what someone else is thinking, that is the prize. You don't need to prove that you moved on. You simply live. You don't need to make them jealous. You don't need to show them what they're missing. You don't need to create a performance of happiness. You become genuinely fulfilled. And when you become fulfilled, you stop chasing emotional crumbs. You stop accepting inconsistent attention. You stop confusing chemistry with compatibility. You stop confusing longing with love. You stop confusing someone's potential with their reality. You start choosing people based on consistency, respect, emotional availability, and shared values. That is what transformation does. It doesn't make you stop loving. It teaches you to love without losing yourself. And if that person comes back one day, you can meet them from strength rather than desperation. If they don't come back, you continue forward with gratitude for the lessons. Either way, you win. Because your life is no longer dependent on one outcome. You have released the need to control what another person does. You have accepted that some chapters end without the closure you wanted. You have learned that sometimes closure is something you create, not something someone else gives you. And perhaps one day you will look back at the person you were when you were waiting, worrying, checking, hoping, and hurting. You will feel compassion for that person because they were doing the best they could with what they understood at the time. But now you know better. Now you know that love should not require self-abandonment. You know that silence does not define your value. You know that someone's inability to choose you does not mean you were unworthy of being chosen. and you know that your future cannot be built around somebody else's hesitation. So stand up, move forward, build your life, strengthen your faith, protect your peace, become disciplined, become courageous, become the person you were meant to become. And if someone returns, let them meet the new you. If they don't, let your life still be extraordinary, because the final victory was never making them afraid of losing you. The final victory was realizing that you were never supposed to lose yourself trying to keep them. That is when the silence loses its power. That is when the waiting ends. That is when your life begins again.